The Running Man from 1987, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, is a movie that I grew up on, so obviously I have a lot of admiration for it. So I fully admit that this could be my nostalgia talking when I say I'm not entirely sure we needed another adaptation of Stephen King's story. But in typical modern Hollywood fashion, we're going to be getting one anyway. And why not? Because it worked out so well for Total Recall. Let's discuss.
I watch so you don't have to.
All I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
So lately it feels like a lot of studios and filmmakers have been dipping into Stephen King's back catalog of stories. And to be fair, it has been happening for a while now to varying degrees of success. It usually depends on the filmmakers involved and whether or not they truly understand how to bring a Stephen King story into another medium.
That makes sense.
Now you have your Mike Flanagans and your Frank Darabont's who always seem to get it, and I think that comes from those filmmakers having a lot of admiration for Stephen King's stories to begin with. But when it comes to Edgar Wright's The Running Man, which we now finally have a trailer for, I'm just not sold that this was the right move, that this was the right story at this time or ever to tackle once again. I just feel like the original from 1987, while it's not Shakespeare, did say everything that needed to be said. It's not a cinematic masterpiece by any means, but it is beloved, and that's even harder to overcome, especially in some fans' eyes. It's a film that I believe doesn't get enough credit for just how accurate some of its predictions were when it comes to real-world economics, societal issues, and most importantly, people's eventual obsession with reality TV in the modern era. And it just so happens to be a pretty badass action movie on top of that, as it gives a more futuristic depiction of what classic gladiator battles on a public stage might look like. In a lot of ways, I guess you could say that it's timeless in its messaging, even if it is a bit dated in its presentation.
We give them what they want!
And I guess the thinking here, like most reimaginings, is that there is an opportunity to tell this story to a new generation of people. And they will, in effect, inevitably try to modernize the material to the best of their abilities. But I did just kind of illustrate that outside of the visuals, I'm not entirely sure that it needs to or even can be modernized. And this is the major problem that I have with yet another adaptation of Stephen King's The Running Man. I'm still not sure that it is entirely necessary for a multitude of reasons. I've always said that the best remakes take the core concept of the original story and take it in a completely different direction. Now, I understand that this isn't technically a remake, it's just another adaptation, but even still, you will have people inevitably comparing it to the original film, and that's the risk that you take when the original is the definitive version of this story in a lot of people's minds.
It's true.
You need to give people a reason to care about this new movie. You need to justify its existence. Now, a lot of modern filmmakers seem to take the "we are going back to the original source material" approach when trying to set their film apart. But in cases like The Running Man, I'm just not entirely sure that it's going to matter. I would venture a guess and say that more people are familiar with the Arnold Schwarzenegger movie than they are the original Stephen King story. In fact, I would even assume that a lot of people didn't even know that that original movie was based on a Stephen King story to begin with. So again, it's going to inspire unflattering comparisons to the original film and not the original story. Based on the trailer, it does look like Edgar Wright is going for a more fast-paced, chaotic, and kinetic vibe with his version of the film, which is probably very intentional because that's the sort of thing that's appealing to modern audiences with short attention spans.
You're really talking about just raising your standards.
And to be fair, the original would probably be considered slow to some by modern standards. But to me, this movie needs to be more than just fast-paced if it's going to capture people's attention. The whole setup of the Running Man game show in-world this time around has been altered. We don't have the stalkers, these gladiatory figures that hunt down the contestants, and I think that's going to remove a significant amount of charm from the film. This time around, it looks a little bit more open world, and basically anyone has the opportunity to take a contestant down. He is literally being released into society and tasked with surviving. It's basically us every day. Now, I don't hate this alteration, again, outside of not having the stalkers, which I think was a big selling point of the original movie. I think there will be some obvious social commentary contained within this film, how society as a whole can easily be corrupted into doing pretty much anything if it means improving their status.
Just a sick world we're living in, sick people!
But at the same time, in a weird sort of way, because the conflict isn't as contained, I think it runs the risk of being a bit too random and chaotic overall. So I do think that it will be interesting to see how they attempt to pull that off. As far as the world itself, it very much still has a totalitarian state dystopian vibe that the first film did, which is necessary and welcomed. But this brings me to our lead character, Ben Richards, who this time around is being played by Glen Powell. Now listen, I like Glen Powell a lot. I think he has all the makings of being a future megastar. At the same time, I think taking on a role like this is risky because it does invite those comparisons that we were talking about. Comparisons with one of the biggest movie star attractions of all time, that being Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Stop it!
Honestly, it does feel very similar to the way that they used Colin Farrell to replace Arnold in Total Recall. It's basically the filmmaker saying, we know we don't have anyone in the modern era like Arnold, so let's just go in a completely different direction and get the it guy of the time. And even if he's not as physically imposing as Arnold, because nobody really was, hopefully this person has enough charisma and acting chops to pull this off in a much different way. And you know what? I actually think that sounds good on paper. I like the thought process behind it. The problem is that Glen Powell is now going to be living in a very large Austrian-sized shadow. And that's not Glen Powell's fault. There's literally no way to escape that. I would argue that most of Arnold Schwarzenegger's filmography would not be hit films if he was not involved with them.
You son of a bitch!
He is what made a lot of those films work. His self-awareness, his screen presence, his physique, and even his comedic timing. It was literally the perfect storm, taking all of that and pushing him into these 80s action films. It's never really been replicated, and I don't think that it ever will be. These films are very much a product of the time that they were created in. I just don't think these movies work as well without him, and without the tone of the typical 80s action film. Ben Richards was a sympathetic figure in the original film because he was a good guy who just so happened to be working for a corrupt system. He was then framed for something that he didn't do, on top of that forced into a deadly game show for everyone's amusement, and this is why you want to root for him. This is why you want to see him get his revenge.
You look pissed, Ben.
The new film makes it look as if Ben Richards is just a regular guy, down on his luck, and he basically chooses to compete in the Running Man. And I'm sorry, but that just doesn't sound as interesting or as fun to me on the surface level. I think it does open up some interesting possibilities, as seen in the trailer, when we see Ben Richards kind of going mad because everyone is constantly attacking him and because he's constantly being filmed. And that is an angle in this film that was not explored at all in the original film. But is that reason enough to make another Running Man movie? I'm sorry, but I just don't feel that it is. Listen, I'm willing to give this movie a chance, and I will when I eventually sit down to watch it later this year. But this movie has literal massive shoes to fill, and you're always going to be fighting an uphill battle when you try to revisit these cult classic films that everyone seems to love. And based on the first trailer and everything we know about this film so far, The Running Man 2025 seems to be no exception to that.
Y'all be cool. Shut up.